They called her the Dark Goddess, the most beautiful woman in Europe, but beauty became her coffin. In 1980, Dolores Guinness swallowed a bottle of pills and waited for silence. She lived in Givenchy gowns and Warhol portraits. She was worshipped as living art, but inside her own words, elegance is a mask. Without it, I am no one. This is the story of a woman who had everything the world could offer and found that it was nothing at all. The emergency room at a private hospital in Switzerland, 1980. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, harsh and clinical, stripping away all glamour. Paramedics rush through sterile corridors, their footsteps echoing against marble floors that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. On the gurney lies a woman in her mid-40s, her legendary dark hair splayed across white sheets like spilled ink. Her crimson lipstick smudged into a grotesque parody of the perfection she's maintained for decades, her breathing shallow and labored. The nurses recognize her immediately. How could they not? That face has graced the covers of Vogue Paris and Harper's Bazaar. Those cheekbones have been immortalized by Andy Warhol and Salvador Dali. That elegance has defined an entire era of haute couture. Dolores Guinness, heiress to one of the world's greatest fortunes, princess through marriage, muse to artists, icon of an age, the most beautiful woman in Europe, dying by her own hand. The doctors work frantically, pumping her stomach, administering activated charcoal, fighting to save a woman who has tried desperately to save herself by ending everything. The bottle of sleeping pills sits on the counter as evidence. Expensive pills prescribed by expensive doctors, swallowed in an expensive suite. Even her suicide attempt is gilded. When she finally stabilizes, when the immediate danger passes and her vital signs return to something approaching normal, one of the younger nurses, new to this world of treating the wealthy and broken, asks the question that everyone is thinking: why would she do this? She has everything. An older doctor who has spent decades ministering to the afflicted aristocracy, who has seen this story play out too many times in too many expensive hospital rooms, responds with the weariness of someone who knows the truth that society refuses to acknowledge. Having everything and having something worth living for are not the same thing. The news spreads through high society like poison through bloodstream, swift and toxic. By morning, every socialite from Geneva to Paris knows Dolores Guinness has tried to kill herself. Again. Because this isn't the first time. This isn't even the second or third. This is simply the first time the secret couldn't be contained. The first time the carefully constructed facade cracked wide enough for the world to see the darkness underneath. The scandal is immediate and ravenous. The newspapers, those eternal vultures of aristocratic tragedy, descend with headlines that manage to be simultaneously concerned and gleeful. Dark Goddess falls. Guinness heiress in death drama. The saddest woman in the world. The tabloids print photographs. Dolores at galas, Dolores in couture. Dolores smiling that mysterious smile that never reached her eyes. They analyze her life like detectives examining a crime scene, searching for clues, constructing narratives, treating her suffering as entertainment for breakfast tables across Europe. But here's what the headlines don't say. What they can't say because it would indict the entire structure of the world they serve. Dolores Guinness has been dying slowly for decades, suffocating under the weight of beauty and expectation, and a life that looked perfect from every angle except the one that mattered from the inside. The real question isn't why she tried to end her life in 1980. The real question is, how did the most beautiful woman in Europe become the loneliest? How did someone born with every advantage become the walking embodiment of despair? How did elegance become a mask so heavy it crushed the face beneath? To answer that, we must go back to the beginning. Back to before the Warhol portraits and the Givenchy gowns, before the princess title and the society pages. Back to a little girl born into a world that would spend the next 76 years telling her exactly who she had to be, and never once asking who she wanted to become. Paris, 1936. Europe teeters on the brink of war, but inside the insulated bubble of aristocratic privilege, life continues its champagne-soaked waltz toward catastrophe. On a day in September, the exact date disputed because even her birth is shrouded in the theatrical mystery that will define her existence. Dolores is born into the Guinness dynasty. Her father is Thomas Lowell Evelyn Bulkley Guinness, a man whose surname alone opens every door in Europe, whose family fortune is measured not in millions, but in the sheer impossibility of spending it all. Her mother is Joan Yard Buller, daughter of British peerage, a woman whose beauty is matched only by her instability. On paper, it's the perfect union of two great families. In reality, it's a disaster written in expensive ink on parchment that might as well be a death certificate, because Dolores's mother is not well. She's volatile, prone to explosive rages and dangerous impulses, cycling between manic joy and crushing despair in patterns that nobody names as illness because the aristocracy doesn't acknowledge mental illness. They simply call it temperament or artistic nature or nerves and carry on maintaining the facade. But the defining trauma, the moment that will echo through Dolores's entire life like a gunshot, comes not from her mother but from her maternal grandmother. Young Dolores is perhaps 6 or 7 years old when it happens. Her grandmother, Evelyn Yard Buller, has taken a lover, an affair conducted with the passionate intensity that runs through the women in this family like a genetic curse. When the man tries to end the relationship, when he attempts to leave, Evelyn does something that shatters the veneer of civilized society. She tries to shoot him. Dolores is there. She sees it all. The afternoon starts like any other. Tea in the drawing room, adults talking in low voices, the child left to play quietly in the corner as children of her class are expected to do. And then suddenly they're shouting. Her grandmother's voice, shrill with rage and desperation. The man's voice trying to calm her, trying to reason. And then the gun. Dolores watches, frozen in her small chair, as her grandmother, this woman of breeding and refinement, this lady who has taught her about proper posture and which fork to use, transforms into something primal and violent. The sound of the gunshot is so loud in the elegant room, shattering the crystal silence that usually reigns in such spaces. The smell of gunpowder mixing with the scent of roses in a vase. The man survives. The bullet misses. Or perhaps Evelyn's hand trembled at the crucial moment, some last vestige of sanity pulling her aim astray. But the damage to young Dolores is complete and irreversible. She learns in that moment what love looks like in her family. Desperate, possessive, willing to destroy rather than release. She learns that beneath every elegant surface lurks the potential for violence. She learns that the women she comes from are capable of anything when trapped. The incident is hushed up naturally. Money and influence ensure that no charges are filed, no scandal reaches the newspapers, no consequences disturb the smooth surface of aristocratic life. Evelyn is quietly sent away to rest, which is what they call institutionalization when you're wealthy enough to afford discretion. But the damage to Dolores is permanent and profound. She learns that violence lives beneath elegance. She learns that the facade is more important than the truth. She learns that in her world you can commit any crime as long as you maintain appearances. She learns that the gilded cage has bars made of silence and secrets. Most importantly, she learns that the women in her family love with a destructive intensity that consumes everything, and she carries their blood in her veins. Could this childhood have been anything other than a blueprint for tragedy? When violence is normalized and feelings are denied, when maintaining the mask matters more than addressing the wounds beneath it, how does a child learn to be anything other than a beautiful facade concealing unbearable pain? Dolores grows up shuttling between homes in Paris, London, and the family estates in Ireland. A peripatetic childhood of luxury and loneliness. She's educated by private tutors who teach her languages and arts, but never ask her how she feels. She's surrounded by servants who attend to her every need except the need to be truly seen. She's given every material advantage and no emotional foundation. Her father is distant, perpetually occupied with business matters and social obligations, treating his daughter with the benign neglect common to men of his class. Her mother, when not lost in her own psychological struggles, treats Dolores like a doll, something to be dressed beautifully and displayed proudly but never truly known. And then there's Dolores's appearance, which becomes both her greatest asset and her most terrible burden. From a very young age, she is extraordinarily, undeniably, almost supernaturally beautiful. Not the conventional prettiness of English roses or French ingénue, but something more dramatic, more intense. She has inherited her mother's Spanish dancer genes, giving her an exotic quality that sets her apart. Dark hair that falls in waves thick as midnight. Dark eyes that seem to contain centuries of sorrow. Bone structure that photographers will later describe as architecture sculpted by some melancholy god. By the time she's a teenager, the pattern is set. People stop talking when she enters a room, but not to hear what she might say, simply to look at her. She's treated as an object of admiration, a possession to be coveted, a work of art that has somehow learned to walk and breathe. She understands early that her beauty is her only value in this world, that she's being groomed for exactly one purpose: to marry well, to ornament some powerful man's life, to produce heirs and maintain the dynasty. She's a commodity, however gilded the packaging. We were born into privilege, not happiness, she will later say, in one of her rare moments of public honesty. People think they're the same thing. They're not. But at 15, at 17, at 19, she doesn't yet have the words to articulate what she feels. She only knows that something is wrong, that the cage is beautiful, but it's still a cage, that being worshipped for your face is a peculiar kind of invisibility. The bars are golden, but they're still bars. By the early 1950s, Dolores has reached the age where her purpose must be fulfilled. She must marry. It's not a question of if, but whom. And the selection process has nothing to do with love and everything to do with maintaining dynasties and consolidating wealth. At 19, she marries Patrick Guinness, keeping the family name that will define her for the rest of her life, becoming more Guinness than ever before. He's appropriate, wealthy, well-connected, acceptable to both families. The wedding is elegant, photographed for society pages, everything a wedding should be by the standards of their world. But the marriage itself is a suffocation chamber decorated in good taste. Patrick expects what men of his class always expect: a beautiful wife who will be seen but not heard, who will run his household efficiently, who will produce children and ask nothing for herself. Dolores tries to fulfill this role. She's been trained for it her entire life. But she discovers something terrifying. She doesn't know who she is beneath the performance. When she's alone, when there's no one to perform for, she feels like nothing. A void in a designer dress. The marriage lasts several years. The exact duration unclear because aristocratic failures are documented with deliberate vagueness, before ending in quiet divorce. No public scandal, no dramatic revelations. Just the understated dissolution of a union that never had substance to begin with. Friends from this period later described Dolores as a ghost, present but not there, going through the motions of living. But if her first marriage is a disappointment, her second is a catastrophe dressed as a fairy tale. In 1969, at 33, Dolores marries Prince Karim Aga Khan IV, the 49th hereditary Imam of Ismaili Muslims and one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the world. The wedding is international news. A Guinness heiress marrying a living spiritual leader and prince. It's the stuff of fantasy, of romance novels, of every little girl's dream. Except Dolores stopped believing in fairy tales long ago. The marriage transforms her from wealthy socialite to actual royalty. She becomes Princess Aga Khan, gaining a title that opens doors she didn't know existed. She's photographed at state dinners and charity galas, always impeccable in couture, always serene, always playing the role of the perfect consort. But behind the scenes, the cage tightens. Aga Khan is brilliant, charismatic, and utterly controlling. He has specific ideas about what his wife should be: elegant, refined, decorative, deferential. He expects her to sublimate her identity, whatever remains of it, to his. She's to be a princess in the most traditional sense, beautiful, silent, ornamental. And Dolores, who has never been allowed to be anything but ornamental, who has spent her entire life as an object of admiration, begins to understand that this marriage isn't a partnership. It's ownership with a royal title attached. She starts appearing in New York more frequently, drawn to the city's energy, its permission to be strange and damaged and honest about it. She becomes a fixture at Studio 54, where disco beats provide temporary amnesia and cocaine offers brief respite from the crushing weight of being Princess Dolores Aga Khan. More importantly, she finds her way to Andy Warhol's factory. The factory in the late 1960s and early 1970s is a strange, fevered dream of a place. Part art studio, part social experiment, part asylum for the beautiful and broken. Silver walls reflect fractured images of everyone inside, multiplying them into infinity, making it impossible to tell what's real and what's reflection. Warhol recognizes in Dolores something he's always been drawn to: beautiful wreckage. He collects damaged aristocrats the way some people collect butterflies, pinning them in place, preserving them, making them immortal through his art while simultaneously exposing their fragility. He calls her one of his dark goddesses and begins creating portraits of her. The process is strange, impersonal, Polaroids taken in harsh light, conversations that circle around meaning without ever landing on it. Warhol's pale presence observing her with those hooded eyes that see everything and reveal nothing. The resulting silkscreens are haunting. Warhol somehow captures not just her beauty but the sadness beneath it, the way her eyes seem to look through the viewer toward some distant escape that will never come. He uses dark, moody colors, deep purples and midnight blues, rather than his typical bright pop palette. It's as if he knows that Dolores can't be rendered in cheerful tones, that she requires shadows. He's not just documenting her face, he's documenting her imprisonment. Years later, after both of them are gone, art critics will write essays about these portraits, calling them studies in aristocratic melancholy and the dark side of the jet-set dream. But in the moment, Dolores simply sees herself multiplied, repeated, turned into a commodity, which is, she realizes with grim humor, exactly what she's always been. Salvador Dali also becomes obsessed with her, calling her his dark muse. His paintings of her are more explicitly surrealist. She appears fragmented, melting like his famous clocks, trapped in impossible geometries that represent her psychological state more honestly than any photograph ever could. In one particularly disturbing piece, her face is a cage, the bars made from her own bones, her eyes looking out from behind the prison of her own beauty. She's inducted into the International Best Dressed List Hall of Fame. Vogue Paris features her in spread after spread. Harper's Bazaar declares her the most beautiful woman in Europe. Fashion editors worship at the altar of her elegance. But all Dolores can think, standing in front of mirrors while stylists adjust couture gowns that cost more than most people's houses, is, elegance is a mask. Without it, I am no one. By the mid-1970s, the mask is cracking. Her marriage to Aga Khan deteriorates rapidly. He grows frustrated with her melancholy, her inability to simply be happy with everything he's given her, as if depression could be cured by jewels and titles. She feels herself disappearing, becoming less a person and more a role she can no longer remember how to play. In 1975, after 6 years of marriage, they divorce. The separation is handled with discretion. Aristocrats always protect their darkest secrets, but rumors circulate through society like wildfire. Some say Aga Khan tired of her sadness. Others say Dolores couldn't bear another day in the cage, even a royal one. The truth is simpler and more devastating. They were two people who should never have married, brought together by circumstance and expectation, and Dolores was slowly dying in a relationship that treated her as an object rather than a person. After the divorce, she's unmoored. Without the role of princess, without the structure of marriage, without the performance that has defined her existence, Dolores doesn't know who she is. She's 40 years old and has never been allowed to discover her authentic self. She tries to find it at the bottom of bottles, in handfuls of pills, in the arms of temporary lovers who want the dark goddess but run from the broken woman beneath. And then she makes her first suicide attempt. It happens quietly, in a hotel room somewhere in Europe. The exact location deliberately obscured by family and handlers who understand that aristocratic scandals must be managed with precision. She chooses a Tuesday, for no particular reason except that Tuesdays feel like the loneliest day of the week, the day furthest from both the memory of the weekend and the hope of the next one. She sits on the edge of the bed in her elegant suite, still wearing the couture dress from whatever event she attended that evening. She hasn't bothered to remove her makeup or take down her hair. What's the point? She takes the pills methodically, one after another, washing them down with champagne because even in dying she maintains a certain style. As the medication begins to take effect, as the edges of consciousness start to blur, she feels something unexpected. Relief. Not happiness, not peace exactly, but simply the absence of the relentless pressure to perform. For the first time in decades, nobody is watching. Nobody is judging. Nobody needs her to be beautiful or elegant or appropriate. She thinks with drowsy clarity that this is what freedom must feel like. But she wakes up. Someone, a maid, a concerned friend, the details are never made clear, found her in time, called doctors, ensured her survival. She's hospitalized privately, treated discreetly, returned to her life as if nothing happened. Except everything has happened. She's crossed a line. She's admitted, at least to herself, that she can't survive this life, that the cage is killing her, that beauty and wealth and status are not enough to compensate for the absence of selfhood. It happens again. Mid-1970s, another attempt, another close call, another hushed-up scandal. And again. Each time the family mobilizes to protect the Guinness name, to ensure no word reaches the press, to maintain the facade that Dolores is fine, that she's simply going through a difficult period, that she'll emerge from this phase still elegant, still appropriate, still playing her role. But Dolores is learning something crucial. She cannot escape the cage by dying inside it quietly. If she wants freedom, it will have to be loud. It will have to crack the facade so thoroughly that everyone can see the truth. And so, in 1980, she swallows that bottle of pills not in a discreet hotel room, but in a way that cannot be hidden, cannot be hushed up, cannot be ignored. The 1980 attempt forces everything into the open. When Dolores is rushed to that Swiss hospital, when the scandal breaks in newspapers across Europe, high society is forced to confront what it has always known but refused to acknowledge. That one of their most celebrated members has been suffering for decades, that the beautiful life is killing her, that the cage is real. The reaction is telling. Some friends rally with genuine concern, visiting her in the hospital, promising support. But many, perhaps most, distance themselves. Because Dolores has committed the ultimate sin in aristocratic society. She's made her pain visible. She's broken the facade. She's admitted that something is wrong with the beautiful world they've all agreed to pretend is perfect. Mental illness is embarrassing. Suicide attempts are unseemly. By refusing to suffer in silence, by making her desperation public, Dolores has violated the unspoken code that has governed her entire life. When she's released from the hospital, physically recovered but psychologically devastated, she faces a choice. continue the performance, or finally stop pretending. She chooses truth, or at least a version of it. Dolores begins retreating from the social circuit that once defined her existence. She still appears occasionally. You don't simply leave aristocratic society, it's in your blood, it owns you, but she's different now. More withdrawn. Less willing to play the game. More honest about her struggles in the few interviews she grants. To one journalist brave enough to ask real questions, she says something remarkable. "I lived in a gilded cage. The world saw gold. I saw only bars." It's the most honest sentence she's ever spoken publicly, and it costs her. The aristocracy doesn't appreciate honesty. They prefer the comfortable lie of perfection, the conspiracy of silence that protects everyone from having to acknowledge the cruelty of their world. But Dolores is past the point of caring what they think. She's survived multiple suicide attempts. She's been married and divorced from royalty. She's been called the most beautiful woman in Europe and felt like the most worthless person alive. What does she have left to lose except the pretense that has been slowly killing her? She starts painting. Not as a career. She has no need to sell her work, no need for another performance of artistic credibility, but as therapy, as a way to externalize the darkness she's never been allowed to express. Her paintings are disturbing, surrealist, brutally honest in ways she's never been allowed to be in life. She paints women in cages, sometimes literal cages of gold bars, sometimes more abstract prisons made of flowers and jewels and beautiful things that suffocate. She paints women with their faces hidden behind masks of porcelain perfection, cracks showing where the real face pushes through. She paints women drowning in luxury, sinking beneath waves of silk and diamonds. She paints women fragmented into pieces that no longer fit together, scattered across canvases like broken dolls. The paintings are never exhibited publicly. They're too raw, too revealing, too much of an indictment of the world she comes from. But she doesn't paint them for an audience. She paints them because it's the only way she knows to speak the truth without words, to show what it looks like inside the gilded cage. When a rare visitor to her home sees the paintings and asks about them, clearly disturbed by their darkness, Dolores responds with characteristic honesty. "This is what it looks like inside." The visitor changes the subject quickly, uncomfortable with the admission, preferring to retreat back into the comfortable fiction that Dolores's life is enviable. She also begins speaking more cautiously, carefully about mental health, about the pressure of beauty, about the prison of privilege. Not as an activist. That would be too public, too aggressive for someone raised to be decorative. But in her own quiet way, she starts telling fragments of truth to journalists brave enough to ask real questions. In the 1980s and 1990s, as she moves through her 50s and 60s, Dolores continues living but never quite thriving. She has found a kind of peace, but it's the resigned peace of someone who has stopped fighting and simply accepted that this is what her life is, not happy but stable, not fulfilled but surviving. She maintains her appearance. She's still Dolores Guinness after all, still listed among the world's best-dressed women. But there's less performance in it now. She dresses for herself, or perhaps out of habit rather than for the approval of others. She lives in various elegant homes, Switzerland, Paris, occasionally London. Always surrounded by beautiful things, always somehow alone. The gilded cage has simply become more literal. Instead of social expectation, it's physical spaces that contain her. Friends from these later decades describe her as having made peace with her demons, but it's clear from her rare public comments that the peace is fragile, negotiated daily, always one bad day away from collapse. When photographers occasionally ask to shoot her, drawn by the legend, by the face that defined an era, she sometimes agrees. The resulting images are extraordinary. She's older now, her face showing the passage of time, but that dramatic beauty remains. And now, finally, the sadness in her eyes matches the sadness of her life. The mask and the reality have aligned. All my life they called me beautiful, she tells one interviewer in the early 2000s. Nobody asked if I was happy. It's both an accusation and a lament. An entire life reduced to a single quality. Decades of suffering dismissed because she looked good in couture. On July 11, 2012, Dolores Guinness dies at age 76 in her home in Switzerland. The cause of death is listed as natural causes. Old age, the body finally giving up after decades of fighting the mind's desire to quit. The obituaries that follow are predictable, respectful, and thoroughly dishonest. They chronicle her life as achievement rather than endurance. Wealthy heiress, princess, fashion icon, muse to great artists. They show the famous photographs. Dolores in Givenchy, Dolores at Galas, Dolores immortalized by Warhol and Dali. The Guardian calls her one of the great beauties of the 20th century. Vanity Fair describes her as the epitome of jet-set glamour. The New York Times notes her place in fashion history with clinical precision, but none of them, not one, mentions the suicide attempts. Not one acknowledges the decades of depression. Not one questions whether the beautiful life was worth living. Even in death, the facade is maintained. Even in obituary, the mask stays on. The funeral is private, attended by aging aristocrats who remember when Dolores was not just a name in a newspaper, but a living goddess who graced their parties. They speak in hushed tones about her beauty, her elegance, her place in their world. Nobody mentions that she spent much of her life trying to leave that world by any means necessary, including death. Nobody acknowledges that the woman they're mourning existed primarily as an object, first of admiration, then of pity, finally of nostalgic memory, but never quite as a person with agency over her own story. Her estate, worth millions, is distributed according to her will. Her art collection, including those haunting Warhol portraits and disturbing Dali paintings, goes to museums and family members. Her jewelry, her couture, all the beautiful trappings of her beautiful life, are catalogued and dispersed like artifacts from an archaeological dig. But what cannot be distributed, what cannot be catalogued, is the cost of her beauty. The price she paid for being born into privilege. The decades of suffering hidden behind the elegant facade. In the years since her death, Dolores Guinness has largely faded from public consciousness. She's remembered, if at all, as a footnote in fashion history, a face in vintage Vogue spreads, a name in the International Best Dressed List Hall of Fame. The world has moved on, as the world always does, to worship new goddesses, to admire new faces, to forget that every icon they elevate is a human being who might be suffocating under the weight of their adoration. But Dolores' story matters more now than ever, because she represents something that still exists, that still destroys lives daily. The prison of beauty, the cage of privilege, the suffocating weight of being valued only for your appearance. She lived in an era when women like her had no choice but to be ornamental. But that era hasn't truly ended. It's simply become more subtle, more insidious, more skilled at disguising the cage as freedom. She spent decades trying to tell people this truth in the only ways she knew how. Through her obvious sadness, through her suicide attempts, through her rare moments of brutal honesty that made everyone uncomfortable. "I lived in a gilded cage," she said. "The world saw gold, I saw only bars." But nobody wanted to listen. Because listening would mean acknowledging that their entire social structure was built on cruelty, that their world required sacrifices, that privilege and pain are not mutually exclusive but often inseparable. There's a photograph of Dolores from 1968 that captures everything you need to know about her life. She's at a gala in Geneva, wearing a stunning black Givenchy gown that makes her look like a goddess carved from midnight. Her hair is swept up in an elegant chignon. Her makeup is flawless. She's surrounded by people, laughing, drinking, celebrating. But if you look closely at her face, you can see it. She's not present. Her eyes are focused somewhere beyond the camera, beyond the party, beyond the moment. She's looking toward an escape that will never come. That photograph hangs in a museum now, part of an exhibition on 1960s glamour. Museum visitors stopped to admire it, commenting on her beauty, her elegance, the romance of that era. Nobody sees the prison. Nobody sees the bars. She lived 76 years. But how many of those years were truly hers? She was the dark goddess in couture, the most beautiful woman in Europe, the princess and the muse and the icon. But was she ever the woman beneath? Was she ever allowed to be Dolores, whoever that might have been, rather than the performance of Dolores that everyone demanded? The answer is no. And that's the real tragedy. Not that she died, but that she never truly lived. She was born into a cage, spent her entire life in that cage, and died in that cage. And the world called it privilege. The dark goddess is gone now, her legend fading into the same obscurity that swallows all beautiful things eventually. But the cage remains. It's still being built, still being gilded, still trapping people who have the misfortune to be born beautiful and wealthy and expected to be grateful for it. Dolores Guinness tried to tell us. She showed us the bars. She painted them in her art, spoke them in her rare interviews, lived them in her desperate attempts to escape. If beauty is a prison, can anyone inside the gilded cage ever be free? Dolores Guinness showed us the mask. The question is, are we brave enough to see the bars?